As a police officer, I've seen my fair share of scary situations, but there was one call that still sends chills down my spine. It was a dark night. A storm seemed to be coming. The kind of night where you really just wanted to stay inside and huddle under a blanket. But duty called and my partner and I were dispatched to a disturbance at a local apartment complex. When we arrived, the complex was eerily quiet. Way too quiet. The only sound was the pounding rain on the pavement. We made our way to the apartment in question and we knocked on the door. There was no answer. We knocked again, louder this time, and still no response. I tried the handle and to my surprise, the door was unlocked. We cautiously stepped inside, our flashlights illuminating the darkness and empty space. We called out, but there was no answer. As we made our way through the apartment, we noticed something strange. There were no personal belongings, no pictures on the walls, no furniture, nothing. It was as if the apartment had been emptied out. But then we heard a noise coming from the back of the apartment. A faint scratching sound like somebody was trying to open a window. We drew our weapons and made our way towards the noise. When we got to the back room, we saw a figure huddled in the corner. It was a woman with long hair and torn clothing. She was rocking back and forth and muttering to herself. We tried to talk to her, but she was unresponsive. We realized that something wasn't right, and we shone our flashlights around the room, and that's when we saw it. There was a hole in the wall, big enough for a person to crawl through. We could see that the drywall had been broken from the other side, as if somebody had punched their way through. As we approached the hole, we heard a voice coming from the other side. It was a low, guttural sound, almost like an animal. My partner and I exchanged a look and then cautiously poked our heads through the hole. What we saw still haunts me to this day. There was a man on the other side, hunched over. He was gnawing on something that we couldn't quite make out. "Police, put your hands up." The man didn't even look up, but he just kept chewing. His eyes glazed over and his body was trembling. I stepped through the hole and approached him, my weapon trained on him. But as I got closer, I realized what he was eating. Now, no, it wasn't a human arm or something crazy like that. Just some food from the local store. The man was broken out of his trance and he looked up at me. His face was twisted into a strange grin. Obviously, he wasn't all there. He was under the influence of other substances. I called in for backup and they soon arrived later. They found the man and they took him away. After it was all said and done, the two of them were just squatting in a vacant apartment and one of the neighbors had heard them making a ruckus. Even though nothing truly bad happened, it still made me question my career choice and really look towards retirement. In order to really paint the picture for you of the scariest event I have ever experienced in my entire life, and to really feel that moment when my blood turned to ice in my veins, I've got to give you a little background on my rather unconventional and messed up childhood. I'll try to keep this part brief. I'm sure this will sound like some utter BS to some, but I assure you that it's not. I'm telling the absolute truth, even if it does sound like a badly produced after-school special. My father kidnapped me from my mother when I was a baby, not because he loved me and couldn't live without me, but because he's a sociopathic douchebag that wanted to hurt my mother as much as he could. I was missing for roughly 6 years, face on the back of a milk carton, the whole nine. My father was an ex-military survivalist that smuggled drugs over the Mexican-American border among other things at that time. During these most formative years of my development, I was surrounded by criminals and raised by this neglectful douche. I had a lot of severe trauma very young. Let's just say that I knew what real monsters were. By the time I was located and returned to my mother just after I turned 7, I knew how to load, clean and assemble several different types of guns. I knew how to aim for the head of the men wearing blue uniforms, and I was a dang good shot with a handgun. I had been left alone for days at a time, repeatedly and often, so I was completely self-sufficient and I could care for myself. I didn't go to school and I had only been around other kids for very rare, brief moments in time. I was a feral little beast at this point. I did not trust adults or anyone for that matter. In my experience, most people were liars and did not show their true face. Lucky for me, I was returned to a loving home with my mother and stepfather. With love, therapy, and protection by the two of them, I think I turned out to be a relatively normal and surprisingly mentally healthy woman, albeit with a few idiosyncrasies. Now the point of all of this preamble is to give you some context regarding the kind of person that I am. I am not a victim. I don't take crap from people, and there are very few things in this world that truly terrify me. I'm a freaking survivor. Growing up the way I did, I studied people intensely as a defense mechanism. I'm very good at reading people and their emotions, at times even the feelings they won't admit to themselves. I have been left with an obsession for my security and of those who I love, so I tend to be hyper-vigilant of my surroundings. This is always a weapon of some type on my person, or in my belongings wherever I go, and I take note of every exit and entrance of any place I step into. As a teenager, my stepfather taught me some tricks on how to take down someone that was bigger and or stronger than me. He was a hell-raising biker and at one time, a bartender and a bouncer at a rowdy biker bar, so he knew his stuff. You would think I would be prepared, right? The story that I am trying to get to here was one of the few times in my adult life that someone had slipped through all my defenses and nearly got to my young daughters. Now, it's one thing to fear for your own safety, but to fear for the safety of your children, as I'm sure every parent knows, is something else entirely. It is ice cold, blood-curdling, absolute sheer terror, and I never ever want to experience it again. I was living in San Francisco roughly 7 years ago. At the time, I managed a medical office inside a large residential drug rehab center. The residents were a mix of characters ranging from the homeless and mentally ill to straight out of San Quentin parolees. I actually enjoyed my work and never felt unsafe there, but it was exhausting. It was Friday at the end of a 50-hour work week, and I could not wait to get home and put my feet up. The building that I worked in was donated by the Catholic Church and used to be an old convent. It is a 4-story stone behemoth, and I ran up and down 3 of those floors all day every day that week. It had been a rough week, and I was deep to the bones tired as well as mentally fried. It was no quick commute home for me, however. My job was in the Fillmore, Lower Heights area, and my babysitter lived near Balboa Park, while I lived in the Sunset District next to SF State. The fastest way home involved walking 2 city blocks to get to a bus, which would drop me off near the closest underground station. From there, hop on a train that would take me all the way across the city, nearly to the end of the line. At least the babysitter didn't live far from the line, so I didn't need to transfer to another bus. Once I had my girls, I would have to wait for the next train to head back down the M line, and finally, a 15 to 20 minute trek on foot to the back of the small city-sized complex where our apartment was. I had made it to the babysitter's house uneventfully, and stood waiting for the next train, counting the minutes down until we would be at our front door. This was an above-ground stop, so my habit was to hold the hand of my 7-year-old and heft my 3-year-old toddler on my hip, clamber up the steps, and carry her through the train to find a seat. Although she was able to walk, she wasn't so balanced on a moving subway train as well as being a toddler, so she tended to fall over and become easily distracted by the other people on the train. Strollers seem to be more of a pain in the ass than they are helpful when dealing with public transit, so this became my routine. Looking back, I'm sure I looked like an easy target. It's not like I present as this badass, hardened and grizzled person. There's really nothing intimidating about me, I don't think. I knew I had balls of steel, but unless you challenged me, no one else would. I was a 27-year-old exhausted single mother, just trying to get home with my kids and belongings in tow. We were on the final leg of our journey home. Being so tired and wiped out, my defenses were down. So when I managed to get up the stairs onto the train, and realized that the car was empty except for one homeless man, I just didn't feel that it was worth it to continue through the train cars to a more populated one. I observed this guy and quickly took a mental note of him, as was my habit. He was at the end of the train in the last car, right next to and opposite the door that I had entered from. He didn't look to be something that I should be afraid of. Remember, I worked with this population every day, and I knew that most of these people are nothing to be scared of. In my experience, most of these guys just had a shitty life, followed by a series of bad decisions, and/or an inability to learn from their own mistakes. In fact, when I was traveling on my own, it was a habit of mine to sit down in the empty seat next to a homeless person, if they didn't appear intoxicated or schizophrenic, that no one else would take and strike up a conversation. If you ever want to see true joy in the eyes of another human, sit down next to a homeless person and talk to them like a regular person. You will make their day. But I digress. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, unkempt, shaggy dark hair and scruffy facial hair, wearing several layers of raggedy stained clothes with an oversized coat that hung past his knees. He had a tall can of beer in his hand that I had noticed, but he didn't seem overly attentive to my presence. Even though this man didn't set off a fear response for me, I was not in the mood to deal with an intoxicated hobo with my girls tonight. So I headed up the train, hoping that we would make it on to the next car before we started moving. No such luck. Being the only group that got on the train at this stop, the train pulled off quickly and I had only made it near the end of the car. Balancing a tot on one hip, holding the hand of the other and all the weight of the bags and purses on the other shoulder, we just kind of dropped and wilted into the empty seats that we were next to at the front of the car. We didn't have to go far now, and I could see from my vantage point 2 people on the car ahead of me. I was in the habit of placing my girls on one seat to situate bags, and I always sat on the aisle seat as a protective measure. While we were getting settled and the train gets going, I hear this guy in the back start singing to himself. Honestly, I don't remember what. I just remember he seemed happy. I had filed this away in my brain as just another homeless guy riding the train at night, on a loop to stay warm, which they did often. Most of the time, they didn't bother anyone because they don't want to get kicked off the train. I figured he had panhandled enough that night for a beer and a ticket, and I did not begrudge him a little joy and warmth, as long as he stayed away from my kids. As I'm sitting there attending to my girls, kind of half aware of the hobo in the back, I slowly register that his singing is getting a little louder, more boisterous and closer. I glance over my shoulder to see him hobbling in our direction, and looking at my toddler who is peeking at him over the back of the seat as she's sitting on her knees. I start to pay a little more attention to his whereabouts, but again, there's nothing that says to me he's dangerous. I have no problem enforcing boundaries with strangers in public, but I also have a lot of compassion for these guys. After all, with a couple of different turns in my own past, that could have been me. It's apparent this guy has had more than one tall boy that night, as he is sort of swaying and slurring his words. But he appears to be singing for my little top because she is tickled pink, giggling and smiling the more animated his singing becomes. I study his face, but his smile doesn't seem creepy to me at all. He honestly doesn't seem like a possible Chester to me or have any ill intent. He just seemed to enjoy entertaining an adorable little girl. Maybe he had had kids of his own somewhere that he had missed, or maybe he was just lonely. Even so, I didn't want to engage with this guy and encourage him, so I was paying a little more attention to what he was doing now out of my peripheral view. By this time, he had made it pretty close to us and he had dropped into a bench seat that was a couple rows on the opposite side of us, roughly 7 feet away. We were sitting in the forward-facing seats at the front of the car. Now, I was wary but still not afraid or skeeved out by this guy. He starts chatting at me at this point. In his slurred speech, he says, "Beautiful family you got there. You're a lucky mom to have such cute kids." I'm so not in the mood to talk to anyone right now. But as I said, I have too much compassion for people down on their luck, so I just politely say, "Thank you," without turning around. Still slurring, he launches into a tale about the family he used to have, and everything that had went wrong with his life. It doesn't seem to matter to him that I'm not really engaging, but he's not coming any closer to us, so I don't stop him or interrupt. Now what happens next is my first inkling that this guy may not be what he seems. It's not so much what he says that does it, but the sudden shift in tone and personality. He's not slurring anymore. The volume of his voice had dropped a bit, and the tone of his voice changes to this Hannibal Lecter smugness. He's not talking to me anymore, but at my tot who was peeking at him again over my shoulder. "Hello, little girl." Now this guy had my full attention. Every cell in my body is saying, "Pay attention to this. Hello, Clarice, weirdo." I look over my shoulder to look directly at him, and really assesses his demeanor. His joviality seemed to be gone and I don't see a happy hobo anymore, but a leering grin on his face that doesn't reach his dead-looking brown eyes. He is looking at my littlest tot, but then shifts his eyes to look at my 7-year-old, who is also staring at him, although looking less entertained than her sister. This is the moment my blood runs cold. In that same Hannibal tone of voice, still not slurring, he says, "Oh, aren't you the pretty one? Such pretty white skin. So sexy." I'm looking directly at him when he says this, and what I see in his face had me terrified. I did not like the way that he was looking at my daughter, like she was a piece of meat. He realizes that I'm looking at him, and shifts his eyes to look at me now, and grins a little wider to show me a perfectly white intact smile that seems incongruous with the rest of his getup. I also notice that while his attire is dirty, he himself seems pretty clean, and his scruffy facial hair has a distinct line as if he had shaved it that way with purpose. Now maybe I'm just paranoid due to my past. Maybe this guy had gotten free dental work. Maybe he had showered at a shelter but had nothing clean to put back on. Maybe he had gotten a free shave from a barber giving back. There are plenty of plausible explanations for what I observe, but it's when I lock eyes with this guy that alarm bells go off in my head. What kind of man calls a 7-year-old sexy? And why did his demeanor change so suddenly? Why did he seem perfectly sober? I have absolutely no doubt this man is a predator. My intuition, which I trust completely, says to get the heck away from this guy now. All of this goes through my head in nanoseconds. I stand up and I pick up my bags, adrenaline surging, heft the little one back up to my hip and grab the hand of my oldest, and head for the door of the car. Because I want the two people in the car ahead of me to hear, I wait for the doors to open before I turn back to him and loudly say with my mama bear authority, "You stay away from us." I didn't care if I was wrong in my assumption, and I didn't care anymore if I hurt his feelings. I lumber to the front of this car and again sit in the very frontward seat. I don't go any further because this happens to be a long train, with probably 6 or 7 cars, and I don't see anybody on the next couple of cars from my vantage point. I wanted to stay with the other passengers. It's not unusual for this train to be empty this far away from downtown, and at this time in the night, in between the commute rush and the Friday night club crawl. I'm used to disembarking alone, or with very few others on my stop when I work this late. I'm starting to panic at this point about what I would do at my stop coming up. It is also on the part of the line that is still above ground, and I'm not going to have a crowd of people to get lost in. This creep could easily follow me on my walk through the complex and either attack me alone or follow me home. Because I'm pondering my predicament and literally terrified, I don't immediately register that the people who are on the car with me have gotten off the train and I am now alone again. Several minutes go by and we are getting closer to our stop, when I hear the whoosh of the car doors opening behind me. Please be another passenger. I'm praying to myself before I look behind me. Nope. It's creepy Hannibal Hobo, heading towards me again, but this time he's glaring at me. No more smile, no more singing, no more slurring. Just an evil glare as he plods my direction. He's got his left hand up on the overhead bar with his right hand, seeming to hold something inside his jacket as he plods toward me. My stomach drops into my toes and my heart leaps into my throat. We are all alone, several cars behind anyone that I can see. I don't wait to find out what he's got in his jacket. I hadn't set down any bags this time. They were still over my shoulder and I was still holding my youngest. So I grab the hand of my oldest and tell her we need to get to the front. I can tell that she is scared now too, but I'm trying not to frighten her too bad. I kind of push and pull her gently in front of me, thinking, if I can get to the front car, even if it's empty, I'll be right behind the conductor. I'm going as fast as I can, which isn't very fast with everything that I'm juggling. As I'm nearing the doors again, I can see that the next car is empty, but the next car has people. I'm almost there as long as he doesn't catch up to us, and we would be safe. We are now almost to my stop, and the train is slowing down again. I hear the doors swoosh open again behind me. Crap, crap. I glance over my shoulder to see this guy running at me. Jesus. I had never been so terrified in my entire life. I moved as fast as I can into the next car, but I now know I'm not going to make it to the next filled with people. And no one seems to be looking this way from the car ahead, and the train is pulling into the stop. This is that moment when time just seems to slow down. I'm thinking this guy is planning to incapacitate me with no hands to defend myself, and he was going to run off the stopping train with one or both of my girls. Now my adrenaline is surging and I can feel my heart thumping at warp speed. I drop the bags from my shoulder, not giving one crap about what is in them now. I needed free movement. I tell my 7-year-old to stay behind me as I squat down to plop my youngest on the train floor. In one motion, I turn around to raise up, pull my pocket knife out of my back pocket, and flip it open, taking a wide-legged defensive stance. I don't know if it was the security of my knife in my hand, or that one final surge of adrenaline, but I swear to God as I stood up, I grew. I felt like Mario having just gotten his mushroom. I felt invincible, 3 times my size and superhuman. No one was going to get through me to my babies even if I was going to get stabbed. He stopped dead in his tracks when he sees the knife about 5 feet in front of me. I sway a bit, with the brake on the train bringing it to a halt, but I keep my footing. Without thinking, I scream at this guy. Take one more step and I'll cut your balls off and choke you with them. I see his eyes widen at this. He obviously did not expect this kind of reaction. He looks at my eyes and looks at the knife. Looks behind me at my kids and one more time, glances back to my eyes. And then he turns tail and runs out the open doors and off the train. I barely register a couple of college students by the look of them, hop onto my car and immediately hop off. Probably because I'm still standing there looking like a psycho with a knife out. I hear the ding and swoosh of the doors closing again, and the train moves on. At this point, I just kind of crumple to the floor, and hugged my kids to me and bursted into tears. My oldest was crying now too, while her little sister is just completely bewildered. I didn't move from the floor until we pulled into the next stop at West Portal, where we disembarked and I called my roommate and best friend. He was a man with big biceps and uncanny strength for his size. I wanted him to meet me at the train stop so we didn't have to walk through the complex alone in the dark after this craziness, which of course he did because he's amazing like that. I never stayed on an empty train after that. No matter how tired I am, I will move to a car full of people. I never saw Hannibal Hobo again either, and I don't care to. I don't think he ever wants to meet me again either.